So it's running now, so you can start. So my name is Fiona Tan, and I'm an artist and filmmaker. Editing is, for me, to an extent, sort of sculpting with time. And, you know, you can't be working with video and moving image and not think about time. So time is, on the one hand, it's sort of my tool, what I have, and then at the same time it's the material, because it's what I'm stretching and squashing together and compacting. It's also one of the most difficult things to talk about, I think.
My full name is Fiona Susan Kim-Ling Tan. I'm half Chinese. I moved to Europe 12 years ago and used to jokingly call myself a professional foreigner.
In 96, 97, I was working on a film which was about the identity of the overseas Chinese, and so the Chinese half of my family. I made this piece called May You Live in Interesting Times, where I traveled to interview various family members.
You belong to this big family.
Yeah.
And so there was a story about my father's father in Java, that he had come across a tiger in the jungle. This was in the 1930s. And so I was looking for footage, early footage, that would somehow help illustrate this story. And that's how I ended up in the film archive. And in the end, the story of my grandfather didn't end up in the film, but I saw all this other really interesting material. And so after I finished that piece, I went back to the archive again and ended up sort of happening again and again, that I'd be very interested in a particular photo or a particular film fragment. And then I would always be asking myself, well, why does this interest me so much, and why do I actually end up making a piece with it? For me, as an artist, there's a lot of creative potential for an archive. And personally, I'm just really, grateful that the material is there and that I get access to it, so I'm allowed to work with the material and do with it what I want. It's like going to a flea market. There are people who like flea markets and people who don't, but I'm one of those people who like it because there's always this feeling that you might find something really nice. So it's that hunting for a treasure, and that can be a really nice motivation. Sort of, oh, what am I going to see now? And you're never sure what you're going to find, and that, I suppose, is what always draws me in. This idea that I might discover things or see things that no one else has sort of seen, or that I see them in a particular way. I make particular connections with what I find in a way which other people wouldn't. So. I've been working for the past year on a project at the I Film Museum in Amsterdam. The Film Museum also has the Dutch film archives and opened up their archives to me, so I had complete access. And so it felt like maybe a nice opportunity to be able to actually do something about or with the fact that I've been living in the Netherlands now for at least 30 years. And at the same time as that, it was still during the pandemic. So as many people during lockdown, I was cleaning up a bit. And in the back of my big writing desk, I found this pile of letters, which my father had written to me when I just moved to Amsterdam. So I put them in order and I just sat down and read them. And it really, really surprised me. Something I hadn't really quite realized was that when I just moved to Amsterdam, it was actually really an interesting time in history because it's the time that the Berlin Wall came down and you have the Tiananmen Square protests in China. Mandela is coming to power in South Africa. So there's these really big events, historical events in world history that were happening quite close to each other at that time. And my father, in his letters, he would move from one sentence to the next, from the very small to the very, very big. And then for some reason I thought, how about I try this kind of crazy juxtaposition of putting together these letters with this very early silent material, just showing footage of the Netherlands from about 100 years ago, and see what happens.
The statement by Gorbachev that Russia will demobilize about 500,000 of its armed forces and withdraw a number of tank battalions were grabbing the headlines, but was upstaged by the news about the earthquake in Armenia. What a calamity. It was a very strong earthquake affecting a densely populated area. The offers of help from the whole world were really gratifying. Mankind is not that bad after all, despite all the silly and stupid things he does and the occasional, more frequent, inhumane behaviour. If we could live together more happily and share what we have more equitably, the world would be a much better place to live in. Bunting is back from hospital, although his wound still needs attention, and the vet wants to see him again. It'll be a hefty bill. Anyway.
This very early material is, I think, quite special, and it seems also like it's rather forgotten. The people didn't seem to interest themselves for it, and I found it really, really quite interesting to see. Just people in the countryside, a lot of people working very hard, and it's just sort of a part of. The Netherlands, looking at the Netherlands, walking around in the Netherlands 100 years ago. Particularly when you're talking about early cinema. I know for myself that I am generally more interested in documentary material than in fiction. What I know is that looking at documentary material, I'm just sometimes so amazed at what I see that it's sort of like richer than any fiction I could imagine, that I could make up, you know. So, and that's the thing you have, that reality can be sometimes so much more surprising than any fiction. But on the other hand, you can have a fictional story which is somehow getting at a truth which you can't get at just with a reportage or something, you know? So that there are both ways of approaching it. I come from a generation where I've grown up with both the digital and the analog. And so I just work with both. Usually when I'm preparing a shoot, I have these tests, and These days there are so many different cameras, even in the digital field. It's always, well, what camera are we going to shoot on? So you have the Super 8 film, which is quite small, or you have 35mm film, or you have digital cinema, so HD. And I usually do trial tests, so I try out different cameras and different lights and different lenses and things, and then make this decision. And then for some reason I thought, well, how about I don't decide and just film on kind of all of them? And so for a solo exhibition that I had at the Maxi in Rome, I ended up filming on 6 different cameras. And that became part of the work. So the 6 projections are dedicated each one to one camera. And they have each a different size because of the different sort of the materiality of each medium. It's kind of a portrait of Rome, but in a very unexpected way. Because I filmed it actually in London, in Soane's museum. And John Soane was a neoclassical architect. For him, Rome, classical Rome, was like the ideal that you would strive for. And so as a young man, he had traveled to Rome, did the Grand Tour, and then could never return because of the wars in Europe at that time. So Rome sort of remained this ideal that he could actually never revisit and never reach. But he ended up collecting bits of Rome that he filled his house with. And his house now, it's virtually unchanged since when he died. And so he was building up his collection at the same time that the British Museum was building up their collection. And it's basically a very early prototype of a museum. So I came to think about the collection and then about the document and the archive. And I think it is important to not necessarily say, oh, this archive is bad because it has colonial images or something, but always to realize, yes, okay, it has material in it that which we now find problematic, but that's also part of an archive. And you can always reorganize an archive, or you can always reassess or look again at what an archive holds. And the way I work, it's always quite, it's always very overt. It's very clear that I've taken it from somewhere and that I'm doing my thing with it, and that it's just by no means an official history or a covering over or something, because it's always very clear that I've done what I'm doing. History is not something you can close and say, this is it, that's it, done, finished. You have to reassess it and review it, and in 10 years' time we'll look at it differently, and 20 and 30, that's all part of it. But it's fine, time always moves on, and we need to go with the flow. That's also the fun thing of making exhibitions, that you can, I'll be presenting a work which I've presented somewhere else in a different context and with different works of mine, but I'm looking at it again too, and it changes, or for me it's changed. That's quite nice to actually have this constant reevaluation. Because sometimes I think, oh, that work's actually quite good, not bad, and then, oh, no, I don't like that one so much. They're kind of like children that go out into the world, I feel. They have their own life after they're finished, and then I come across them every now and then.